Ladies and gentlemen, good day to everyone. Welcome to our second day of the virtual AB Suite user conference. Today again we have two sessions to present to you. Both will be about 45 minutes long, followed by 15 minutes questions and answers slot. Please type your questions into the chat window and send it to all participants, and then we'll come back to that during the Q&A section. During the presentations, we will mute everyone, and we will have a short break right before the beginning of the second session. So today we'll start and we'll talk about integration technologies, integration capabilities. And first presenter is Gary Taylor. So let me give the stage to you, Gary.
Thank you, Carolee, and welcome to everyone. Let me just share my monitor, and hopefully you can see that.
Yes.
So I'm just going to move that off the screen. That's better. So today we're going to talk about, as Carolee said, about integration, and the first of those two sessions is going to be about the technology that's available to allow you to use that integration or make use of that integration. First, a little bit of background about myself. My name's Gary Taylor. As it says there, I'm a system architect based in the UK, working with a number of other colleagues that are presenting yesterday and tomorrow. I've been working with Link, EAE and AB Suite for many, many years, as perhaps some of you on this call have met with me in the past. So I've got a reasonable bit of background about this, and a lot of what I do is helping people with that integration, and how do they get their application to integrate with other things. And that really is probably the place where I'll start. I've talked about the technology of interfaces as the title for the presentation, but the reality is, why do we need those interfaces? And the real reason is that it's a connected world. It's unlikely that you'll ever put an application today, particularly an enterprise level application, that lives in isolation. Instead, most applications, or virtually every application, will require information from external sources, and that comes in lots of different ways. It may be you're getting information from your end users. It may be you're getting it from other applications. It could be something as simple as validating a postcode or checking somebody's credit rating. It may be just a common routine that you're using to do a particular thing. And it's not only you need to get things into your application needs to provide access to the rest of your organization. So, there may be parts in your organization that can get that information via different routes, but in most cases it's about providing an interface, and that interface is what you will have there to present to the rest of the world. And it's not only just about sort of how you get things in there. You've got to think about your customers, and that may be your end users. It may be people of your business. It may be people outside of your organization. There's lots of different things. And they are now looking for more and new ways to access that data. So we're not just talking about maybe what you could have got away with in the past, which was maybe a character mode screen. Even a nice GUI interface is not what everybody wants. People want more choice. They want to be able to use an app on their smartphone. Others want a web browser type interface. And others may want something even more than that, which is, say, a web service, so that they can use that and build their own interface, and or use it in as part of something else, that information. So it's lots of different ways, and that's really why I've said here it's a connected world. So how does AB Suite help with all of this? Well, let's start by looking at what some of those choices really are, or what do we mean by some of those choices. So I've tried to split it into the concept of inbound and outbound. And really what I'm saying here is inbound is something that's coming from the outside into the server or the service, and outbound is something that the server or the application provides to the rest of the world. So we've got a number of different things here. You know, we've got what you perhaps call the more traditional direct end user interfaces, like a GUI or an older terminal emulator to display the character mode screens. But we also have a service to service those end users via newer options like a web browser, and also cope with a browser screen, you know, that's not only just displayed on, say, an ordinary screen. It may be displayed on a huge monitor somebody has on the wall, or it may be displayed on a small mobile phone screen. So you can't even just look at it from a point of view of, oh well, I can display it on in the web. You've got to build it in a way that gives you the flexibility to cope with the various different things that we may display it on. So, you know, there's a lot more to this now than there used to be. There's also the other side of this as well, where, you know, you may have other people who want to just use the raw data. And essentially, this is what we're talking about here, application to application. An example of that would be maybe a mobile phone app. You know, that would be a consumer to business type transaction. The consumer initiates the transaction, the business deals with it, but how that works with an app is essentially the app is the application. So we have to be able to provide an interface that the application can deal with. Business to business is really very similar, and really all we're saying here, it's just who initiates the transaction. So business to business is another application essentially initiates the transaction. So we're just really different ways and different naming that we're talking about. Outbound is, oops, what happened there? Too far, sorry about that. Outbound is just really the opposite of the inbound things, but it's about you providing, or your application providing, those capabilities. So from an application to application point of view, instead of you getting information from somewhere else, you're providing that information to something else. Now, there's lots of different ways that you could be doing this. You know, it could be a very simple thing, like reading a file that contains some values, or it could be another application. Probably you'll be calling an external service to get that information, maybe something like a web service. So we've got different ways we're looking at it. So it's really about this concept of either you're consuming something, which is the outbound, or you're getting something sent to you, which is the inbound. And maybe the inbound way is you're actually offering a web service to something, and outbound would be where you consume it. So there's different ways and terminology you can use around this, but the principle is you either consume something or you offer something, and that's really what I was trying to get to. So how do we do that? And as the slide says, from the point of view of Unisys and Link, and then EAE and AB Suite, it's something that we have been delivering and providing capabilities over many years. And those capabilities have grown as the product has grown and as the world has moved on. You know, so at the start, we may have had some very simple things like extract files and print files as a way of providing those interfaces. We also provided what I suppose can be really called as application-to-application type interfaces. The NOF, the GLI, the offline, the user programs that are still there in the product today, but have been probably more superseded. You wouldn't generally start with using these. I'm not saying you shouldn't use them. They're still valid, they're still supported, but it's more about the fact that you wouldn't generally use them today for creating anything new. We've also had the ability to call an external routine or an external library. And that's something that I'll cover a little bit more detail as we go through. Terminal emulators, well, that's essentially how everything started. A long time ago, that's what you would have been using. You would have been using a terminal, T27. Some of you may know some of these names, ET1100 or a TD830 even. But they were just a way of displaying a character mode screen. And people created interfaces out of those from an application point of view by using tools to screen scrape. They would pull the information off the screen. You know, it works, it's not the ideal way of doing it. We've moved on with inside the product set, and really the way we would advise anybody to go now is down more towards Rattle. And Rattle is a way that we've got, you know, it's sort of a level, it's part of a group of technologies that we refer to as client tools that allows us a much better programmatic interface, which means that it's much better for creating those graphical screens and or creating those application level interfaces. We've also got Hub, another one of these, it's not really an early thing, but it was more of an application to application type interface. It allowed you to communicate with another Link, EAE or AB Suite Now application. Business Integrator was something that we built on top of Hub, and again that used the Hub mechanism, but it allowed us to talk to not just another Link or EAE or AB Suite application, but to talk to something else. So we could talk using Business Integrator to something like a web service. We've also always had the reality is you could write your own database routines and access the database directly. It's possible. It's not something that I would personally recommend, mainly because you're bypassing the application business rules. And yes, it may seem easy to get to the data, but often the way the data is structured in the database means that you'll then have to do a lot of extra work to be able to process that data or use that data correctly. So it's possible, but not ideal. Now, these are just some examples, and I'm going to cover some of them in a little bit more detail, mainly around external libraries and Rattle, because they're the two more modern type interfaces, and on the back of those, there is a huge amount of capability that we can deliver or make available to allow your application to be both consumed by other people or allowing you to consume other application information from other applications. So I'm going to start off by looking at the inbound interfaces. So these are things that allow you to call into the AV Suite environment. Now, one of the first things that I'm going to talk about is what's called public segment methods. And what these allow you to do is expose a standard LDL plus method to outside applications. And it's available to allow you to do this in a number of different ways. So both the MCP and the Windows platform have a programmatic interface that allows you to directly call this. So you can write an application, be that in COBOL, .NET, Algol, depending on your platforms, that will directly access that public segment method. And because it's a method, it then follows all the rules. As Andy mentioned yesterday, that method can have a return value. It can have parameters on it. Those parameters can have directions on them as well. So we've got quite a lot of capability there with public segment methods that allows us to essentially call into our application, get our application to do something for us, and then return a result. Now, as I've said, it's available directly on the host platform. One of the challenges that we started to see is that some clients, they may not always have people who can write code native for the particular platform. So one of the things we've done, particularly for the MCP platform, is provided some additional technology that allows us to make things available on the MCP available on Windows. And this means that you can, and then effectively, as it says here, we could, via this method, it's called AIS, Application Integration Services, and I'll talk about it a bit more later. But essentially at this point, what you really need to understand is that using this, we can expose those public methods from our MCP host and make them available onto the Windows platform. And essentially on the Windows platform, a developer could write a piece of .NET code that would call all the way through and get to the MCP platform. And the great thing is you don't need to have a huge amount of programming knowledge. In most cases, you won't need to write any code to allow you to do that. I say I'll cover it in a bit more detail later on. The other way we can expose the public segment methods to the outside world, essentially off the platform, is via client tools. Client tools, again, I'll talk about later, but client tools is our tool set that exposes, I don't know what the right terminology is, but it's a client. It provides a client interface, so it's the primary tool we'd use for graphical interface, but it can do much more than that. And one of the things we can use through that interface and those capabilities of client tools is the ability to remotely access public segment methods via component enabler. And again, you can call those routines, you can pass data in through parameters, you can get responses back through the same parameters or via return variables. And as I say, we'll cover both AIS and client tools in a little more detail later, but it's just really making you aware of what potentially we can do. For the Windows platform, we also have some further capability. So not only can we do public methods, but we can also access the iSpec interface directly. So there is a fully supported programmatic interface, as it says there. It's documented in the manuals. There are some example pieces of code, and it's an area where we've made use of this for a number of clients for client engagements that myself and colleagues have been involved in. Some of the real benefits of this is that Component Enabler has some limitations as to how much data you can pass up and down the line. Mainly around the fact that it runs across multiple platforms, so it has to be able to cope with the different platforms. So one of the things you can do with the iSpec interface on Windows is that if you use this, then it allows you to pass in much larger messages. We've used it certainly up to about 4 megabytes. Fields on the screen can be 256K. So the way we got the 4 megabyte message was to essentially create 16 256K fields on the screen. It's not quite as simple, and you need to think a little bit more about using these types of interfaces, particularly this one, because you need to think about, how are you going to deal with things. You're passing in 4 meg, it might take a little bit of time. So do you want it to be single-threaded? You may need to make it a multi-threaded solution, and that starts making it a much, much more complex environment to use. But it is there. It's something that we've dealt with. It's something that my colleague's going to mention in the second session today. But they are capabilities that are in the product if you want to, or potentially want to, make use of them. The Windows platform also has a couple of additional capabilities. First of those is what's referred to originally as Client Framework, but now in AB Suite 7 is what you will see referred to as UX Mode. And essentially what this is doing is it's sort of saying, well, the painter inside AB Suite, it can do quite a lot of things, but technology is constantly moving in the way user interfaces are developed. And as such, one of the things that the Client Framework does is effectively says, well, let's not bother putting the user interface inside the AB Suite application. So we'll get rid of the painter, and instead we'll create external applications to do that, and we'll provide an interface to those external applications. And the way we do it is we've created essentially a gateway. It's really an alternative to Rattle, and it has some additional capabilities to facilitate that better user experience. So there's some capabilities there to use lists in a different way and various other things. And a number of our Windows clients are already starting to make use of this particular feature. The big thing is that it's quite a big change from where you are today. Again, another capability of allowing people to pass data in, I suppose, is the XML framework. Again, this is another capability. It's part of advanced mode in 7.0. But what it provides is an alternate processing cycle. In link cycle in EAE terms, or in AB Suite we refer to it as framework. So it's an alternate framework. And what this allows you to do is effectively pass in an XML formatted message. That XML formatted message is essentially serialized into a defined class, and you can then write logic that processes that class, and it will then deserialize that back into an XML to return that to the calling application. And there's a wizard that allows you to pass in the definition of how you want that XML to be formatted using the XML definition language XSD. So again, it's only available on Windows today, but that could be an alternative interface that you may want to consider on that particular platform. Now, another inbound client technology is client tools. And one of the challenges with client tools is, we've renamed the product a number of times over the years, and it consists of quite a number of different things inside it. So I'm going to start really by really just talking about the different components that make up the product set. So we've got client tools itself, which is the name of the product. So when we refer to client tools, we're referring to the whole thing. There is then another aspect of it that we refer to as component enabler. And this is really the API layer. And what we provide with component enabler is an API for both the .NET and the Java programming environments. So this is technology that you would use on a client somewhere to talk into an AB Suite application. And the other aspect of component enabler is that it's the thing that will effectively take the calls in from the API, translate them, pass them down the wire to the back-end AB Suite application. We also have the concept of CE clients, component enabler clients, and these are the applications that somebody has built on top of the component enabler APIs. I mentioned this word before, but RATL is really the protocol that is used to talk between the client running the CE API and the host. And that doesn't matter whether that host is MCP, Windows, or in 8.0 OS 2200. And if you're not onto AB Suite already and you're only using EAE, here it's always been available there on EAE as well. We have another component, which is the remote access server. And this is essentially the process that sits at the host level and listens on TCP/IP for RATL messages and the component enabler and the clients above them communicating into the host. Generally, that works through TCP/IP. We've also got the ability on the Windows platform to use MSMQ as well. And the final thing that's part of the client tools product set is we have a bunch of generators. So the concept of CE clients using the APIs, the idea there is you can write your own clients. But we've also provided some clients to give you essentially a default CE client application. So we've got, right. So we've got a number of standard generators. So if you want to display your painted screens, we've got an ASP.NET and a JSP browser-based client. We've also got a VB.NET client, and the reality with that, that's more of a local forms-based interface. Even though it says it's VB.NET, you don't need to write the client in VB. The sample client that we provide is VB.NET, but you could quite easily write that in another language, C#, for example. If you want to offer services or microservices, you've got the capability. We've got a generator which we refer to as the SOAP web service generator, and that effectively just allows you to expose an individual iSpec as a web service. It's very simple to set up, and it provides you some generic capability. We've also got an ePortal generator, and the idea behind this is that it takes information from your AB Suite application, and we can then import that into ePortal. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But the point with ePortal is it's then got a number of other options that you can then build from it. So if you want to build different types of web service, so a REST web service, ePortal has the capability. If you want alternative .NET browser-based interface, ePortal has that. So ePortal is a separate tool set, and we'll come on to it, but it has the main thing here from the point of view of client tools is we have the capability of providing a base level of information to it that we can then use later on. And not only do we have these standard generators, we also have the option where you can effectively take the sources of those standard generators and customize them. And it may be very simple customization. So you may add some, I don't know, some images or something to your ASP pages, or it may be a lot more code. The option's yours. You don't need to, but it's there. Or you could write something from scratch. There is a programmatic interface that allows you to create a generator. And what this allows you effectively to do is take information from your AB Suite application and then use that in some other way. I've written some, and other colleagues have written some to do all sorts of different things. So it's quite a powerful tool. The other aspect of client tools is it's also an enabler of other capabilities. So we've got the ability to support some LDL extensions. The main one of those is a capability to send lists to the client application. So there's a verb in EAE AB Suite called send list, and that's really only usable. Well, it's not a case of really only. It is only usable if you're using the client tools interface. And client tools is also the underlying technology that we use to support the display of painted screens. So if you want any of that painted information that you've created when you're developing your application, you need to use client tools to make use of that. Now, I'm just going to jump off topic a little bit, I suppose, but I'm going to talk about something that we refer to as state. And this is quite important because traditionally most online systems tend to be very what they call stateful. And what I mean by this is that during a session with an end user, you'll navigate from one screen to the next, and information is kept at the server level inside the application as you navigate between screens. Now, that could be all sorts of different things like login information, access permissions, and so on. But from an AB Suite point of view, the very simple way of looking at this is that this information is kept in GlubWork. There are other ways of doing it, but generally it's kept in GlubWork. So if your application makes use of GlubWork in any way, then your application is probably going to be stateful, and so therefore it maintains state from one transaction to the next. If you don't use it, then the opposite is true, and that is it's stateless. And the reason for bringing this concept up of stateless and stateful is that for particularly web services, the concept of a web service, which is one of the typical ways you would want to expose your application. And if you want to create microservices or services, whatever you want to call them, and you use web services to do that, the typical web service is stateless. You call it, you get a response, and you don't care about the next transaction that comes in, you start again. So if you need any security, you have to pass it in. If there's any other rules or anything else that you need to pass in, it all has to come in one go. And the problem with this is, as I said there, most traditional systems tend to be stateful. So what the options are that if you want to make use of that and expose parts of your application to things like web services, then you're going to need some way of either rewriting stuff and making it a single stateless iSpec, for example, or a way of combining that functionality into essentially present an outside world as a single transaction, single web service, but internally maybe have a number of steps that you have to go through, a log on, a navigate, you go to the one you want to, and so on. So as it says there, log on, validate account, an address, retrieve, and so on. And what you can do is you could write a program. You could write your web service so that it does all of this for you and does that navigation and wraps those back-end iSpecs. Or you can use something that will effectively do that for you automatically. So there's a concept of what's called orchestration, which effectively just says, go to this one, get the response, go to the next one, get the response. Both are essentially the same thing. It's just how one is you'll do it manually and the other one is you'd have some sort of tool. And the reason for bringing this up is because ePortal is very good at being used to orchestrate things. So if you want to present a web service to the outside world, you can use orchestration and potentially use ePortal as a way of taking those 4, 5, 6 back-end transactions and putting them all into one. The great thing really with all of this is that it's an excellent way and it allows you to rapidly prototype new functionality and new capabilities without having to do that back-end refactoring straight away. You can leave it to another day and maybe see how things go. Is this a good idea? Yes, we're getting a lot of hits, so let's try and make that more efficient by getting rid of all of those individual transactions and replacing it with one single back-end transaction. The great thing there is you can do that transparently to the web service, so you don't need to change it. So ePortal, I've called it here a helper technology. And the reality is, in the context that we're talking about here, it is just that. ePortal as a product is a very powerful and capable product. It's got far, far more features than I'm really talking about here. But the principal one being amongst all of those is the ability to easily define multiple different interfaces. So as the diagram shows here, we can have our AB Suite connection. We can talk to our AB Suite application. We could also talk to other things. Maybe they're a COBOL program, maybe they're a screen scrape, maybe they're on something other platform. It doesn't have to be Unisys mainframe. And we can put some orchestration in front of that to work out how we're going to do all of that, and then present that in many different ways. So maybe as a mobile application, as a web browser, or as a RESTful web service or a SOAP web service. So it's an alternative to some of the things we've got inbuilt within the product set. And really, the area that I wanted to highlight from a point of view of with AB Suite is the orchestration, and it's really a drag and drop type thing, and it allows you to, as it says there, consolidate several iSpecs into a single user web page. It's relatively easy to use. It does take a little bit of getting used to. It's like all things. If you come from EAE to AB Suite, when you first look at it, it looks quite difficult. Most of the difficulty is around knowledge. Once you understand the environment more, then it becomes very easy to use. And ePortal is the same sort of thing. And you can do as little or as much as you want. You can just create something that is orchestration and use the built-in capabilities, or you can create something that uses more. And so allows you to, customize those default interfaces in different ways, add any more functionality. And as was mentioned yesterday, ePortal has also now got the ability to provide a way of calling into ePortal from the AB Suite application. It's not direct at the moment, but there is a capability there that will allow you to effectively set ePortal up to access a COBOL program. The COBOL program you can then call from AB Suite. We've also got So that was sort of more the messages coming into the application. But what about the application trying to go out? So the application wants to go and consume somebody else's service, somebody else's piece of information, or some other API. And the main thing that we've got, or the main way of doing that, is a facility that I'm going to refer to as external routines. And from an AB Suite point of view, this is methods that you define on a class that is marked as is external. So you create a class, mark it as is external, set to true, and then you define methods on it. We had a similar capability in EAE, and that was called the call command. The real difference here between EAE and AB Suite is that we're no longer limited to a single parameter. So in EAE terms, that was just glub.param, which was a string. In AB Suite, we've got the ability, as we've got with all methods, to pass lots of different parameters. And those parameters can be lots of different things. They can be strings, numbers, booleans, various other things, including things like files. We can get a return value when we call those routines. So we can call an external routine. That external routine can pass us back a return value, or we can use the parameters. There's the parameters. There's another property called direction that we can use to dictate whether the parameters are passed into the external routine or out of the external routine, or I/O. So it allows us to cover it in different ways. Essentially the equivalent of pass by value, pass by reference. And using this, it gives us almost limitless possibilities. So, whatever you want to do. And again, this is an area that I'm going to talk about some of the helper technologies that are around this, but also some of the things in the next presentation about how we've used some of these things to make it easier for people to interface with other things. So what can you call? Well, on the MCP platform, you can call an Algo or COBOL locally developed routine or library. But as I mentioned earlier, we're also seeing people saying, well, we may not have people with the necessary skills to be able to do Algo or COBOL development, or maybe we want to be able to talk off the machine. And that's where Unisys has really come along and tried to deliver some, what I'm going to call here, helper technologies. So we've got a number of those, and I'll cover these in the next few slides. So web app support, application integration services, I mentioned about public segment methods. There's something new on the horizon, not quite released yet, called ClearPath Extension Kit. We've also got things that can also be used in the similar sort of way, called coroutines. They are available on the MCP platform. I'm not going to talk about them, but they're still there. Moving from EAE to AB Suite, you can still make use of them. On Windows, we can call a .NET routine or a non-.NET DLLs, which essentially is how the old EAE would have done it on Windows. We can also call things like the command line shell and executables. So let's look at the first of those helper technologies, web app support. Web app support is really part of the web transaction server. And what that really gives you is access to essentially HTTP web type transactions. And web app support is just really an API layer to make it easier to talk to that particular capability. Because it's an API layer, it has a number of methods that you can call APIs, and those have got parameters on them. So you've always been able to call it from an AB Suite point of view, but as part of 6.1, there was a wizard that was released to make that whole process a lot easier. And essentially what it means is you can use add new item to access that web service. There's a note there about it, and so we will make the slides available later on, but there was a Developing Agility article from one of the engineers in the AB Suite engineering department who put a write-up together about actually using this in the October 2018 version of Developer Agility. If you're not subscribed to it, I would recommend to subscribe to the Developing Agility newsletter. It comes out 2 or 3 times a year and has lots of potential useful articles in it, as I've highlighted here. The next of those helper technologies is AIS, or Application Integration Services. And as I said previously, this is really all about Unisys trying to make it simpler and easier for you to both consume or use the services on other platforms. So what this will allow you to do, it works both ways. So you can go from a .NET routine into MCP. So in other words, that would be calling, say, the public segment methods, or from an MCP to Windows. So there's 2 different ways. Yeah, so what it will, I've just realized what it says here on the slide actually. So if you're on Windows, you'll be able to access it through AIS. And the principle behind how this works is that it creates small proxy programs or proxy routines that wrap the particular things that you're trying to expose. So if you have a DLL or an API or something on Windows, you run the AIS wizard against it. That will create you a proxy. That proxy then has 2 components, one that sits on the Windows side and one that sits on the MCP side. You can then write an external method from an AB Suite point of view that talks to that MCP proxy. You don't need to write any more code. All the code is built for you, so you don't need a lot of programming knowledge. You do need to do a little bit of work, but it's more about following the instructions and going through a set of steps. And the reverse is true. So if you want to access, say, a public segment method on the Windows platform, you'd again run the wizard, but this time against the MCP side of things. That will create you some proxies. So one of those proxies will be delivered on the Windows side, and then you can write your .NET code to access that proxy. It will communicate across the network to the MCP host and then into the public segment method. So it doesn't matter which side you are. If you're on Windows, you can talk to MCP, or MCP talk to Windows, but it means it's very easy to do it, and more importantly, there's very little that you have to do in terms of writing code. And again, there was an article last year in July 2019 talking more about this capability. The third one that I was going to talk about is something not released yet, but again, it was mentioned yesterday, and that's the ClearPath extension kit for MCP. And the prime thing for this is a way of invoking Docker containers. Docker and containers are a way of effectively getting a small Windows, and it can actually be other platforms. It can be Linux as well. But essentially, you can create something in a self-contained environment. The footprint of it is much smaller. You don't have all of the OS overhead that you would do normally. And it allows you access to all sorts of other things. The thing with ClearPath Extension Kit is that all of that runs within inside the security perimeter of the MCP environment. As it says there, though, it's currently, we're referring to as a tech preview. Not quite a beta, but something similar. It's public tech preview, so you can talk to your account team and sign up to it if you're interested. It's only available currently for the ClearPath MCP software series. So if you're running software series, then you may be able to take part in that. The thing what it allows you to do is access to the standard Docker interfaces, which, again, if you're familiar with any of the Windows programming environments, there's a concept of standard in, standard out, and standard error. Essentially, in is the keyboard, out is the screen, and error is just a special type of screen. You can access these via COBOL or ALGOL port files, and there's already a white paper that we've put together that provides details how to do this, along with some sample code of how to access it. So whilst you will need a little bit of programming knowledge at the MCP level to be able to do this, we're giving you some samples, giving you some ideas how to do it, so you don't need to be an expert. Now on the Windows platform, external routines are not just limited to libraries. I've already mentioned this. So we can call out to the command prompt, to a shell. One of the things I haven't been able to do as part of this, but I've got a little demo program that I've had for a number of years, is a sample where effectively you can type in any command line string and get that displayed with inside an AB Suite application. Essentially what you do is you pass in the command line as a parameter and you get back whatever comes back in standard out. There's no reason why you can't call a Docker container on Windows using this. So whilst we have the ClearPath extension kit and you can maybe use that for calling a Docker environment, there's no reason why you can't achieve exactly the same thing on the Windows platform if you wanted to. There's a similar capability to call executables, and the difference there is instead of providing the name of the thing you want to run as part of the command line, you actually call that as a second parameter. Couple of things really, and this works across all of the platforms, but more from a point of view of our own experience, is whenever you call a library, always return a value. Don't assume. We have seen that sometimes failures in libraries don't cause the calling routine to actually fail. So have something in there along the lines of, send back 1 if it's okay, 2 if it failed, and then if you get 0 back, you know it didn't work at all. So you need to be careful of that. If you want to, you can debug your libraries against the runtime systems on Windows. So you can use the attach feature of debugging. And I've used that personally in a number of cases to help me debug some external routine that I was calling by effectively putting in an accept statement or something. That way then I can step through the code at a C# or VB.NET debugging level. The other thing I was going to briefly talk about is Business Integrator. The Business Integrator is essentially a development of hubbing. But the great thing about it is that it allows us to talk out from any platform. So this means it's platform neutral. We don't have to worry about is this, what platform am I writing code for. The other thing behind it is it's designed to work and be used in a very simple environment. And the principle behind it really is you use Hub to talk to a Windows server that essentially looks like a AB Suite on Windows runtime system to Hub. And then within that, it allows us to essentially call something else. So it could be a local program, it could be a call out to web service. Generally, that's what people would use it for. Get a response from that web service and then pass it back into the calling routine. Because we're using Hub, it comes with all of the security that Hub provides us as well, and that may be just another way of helping you. And I say this is something that a number of clients we have seen in the past make use of, and it's a very relatively easy way to get involved in calling out to web services. Maybe now with something like AIS, you may choose that that may be a better way of doing it, or using web app support may be a better way. But this is still there, still supported, and so therefore, if you've already started using this, then we're not going to discourage you from using it, but there are alternatives. So to summarize all of this, there's lots of options. The other thing really is just because you've done it whatever way you're doing it today doesn't make it the best or the right way of doing it. We, Unisys, have continually evolved the product from Link to EAE to AB Suite. The capabilities and the features that are there, and it's not just AB Suite, but other things like AIS, ePortal, and so on, have continually been supported and added to the product set. So what used to be the best way may not be the best way today. The other aspect of this is there's often not a right answer. There may be lots of different ways of doing it. So look at it from the other way. Start with what's the problem I'm trying to solve, rather than focusing on, well, I should use AIS or I should use something else. Understand the problem more. And it may be that the obvious answer is not always the best or the easiest one to use. And the other thing is talk to us, talk to people with inside Unisys. Myself and the next presenter, Nigel Tunnicliffe, we've both got a lot of experience with this, with talking to and working with lots of different clients on lots of different solutions. So we may have some other ideas, alternatives. And it's not just myself and Nigel, there's other people within the company. Andy Wardle was talking yesterday. There are other consultants around the world who may be able to help you. There's our support center as well. So if you've got some questions, got some not sure what to do, come and talk to us, and hopefully we can help you. So with that, I'll say thank you. And is there any questions?
There are several actually, Gary.
Okay.
Andy, could you?
Yeah, I was just going through them. I mean, there was a question about the number of AB Suite on Windows clients, which I think Thanga has answered. I think he suggested we have more than 60 clients use AB Suite for Windows today. There were some questions about. There's a question about getting the white paper about calling Docker, and I've responded to that. So if you look in the if attendees look in the chat window, they'll see some links to both that white paper, the Developing Agility archive, and also the registration for Developing Agility. I guess the only other question is a question from Kurt Thompson. He wanted to know if you were accessing a database on Windows from AB Suite, which technique would you recommend? I guess right now, I would probably think about that and get back to you rather than provide an answer now, Kurt. Depends what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. A lot would depend on what you're trying to achieve. The thing I would generally say, as I've already said, is accessing the database directly bypasses all the business rules, so that I won't say that wouldn't be a way of doing it, but that would probably be the way I'd be least favourable.
And there's a question just in from Matt Garrity. with AB Suite, is JSON messaging supported, or is it just SOAP? I think the AB Suite Client Tools Generator for web services just provides SOAP. I think if you want to do JSON, SOAP, and some of the other capabilities, you're probably going to look at ePortal as a, I mean, I think that gives you a much greater variety of interface types and messaging formats. That's it for questions at the moment. So we want to switch to the, or hand over to presenters and take a short break, Carol?
Yes, let's make a 5-minute break now. So Gary, if you could hand over the presenter right to me.
Well,
we'll do that once the 5-minute countdown.
Yeah, I've just put a 5-minute countdown timer up there, just so people know when we're ready to start again.
All right.
And I'll then share. I'll stop sharing and let Nigel take over.
Okay, so we'll continue in 5 minutes.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I just need to stop sharing.
No.
I haven't got control going.
Ah, okay.
Yeah,
yes.
I have.
All right. Sorry.
Okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, actually wherever you are in the world. My name is Nigel Tunnicliffe. I work with Andy and Gary on quite a lot of the AB Suite projects that they're working on. My main role over the past few years has been helping customers build something to talk to their AB Suite system, whether it's a web service or something slightly different or very unique bits and pieces. And over the time, we built up quite a bit of experience of building strange types of things or different types of things. So we thought we'd go through a few of the examples of things we've done in the past, maybe just as a bit of food for thought, say, oh, well, maybe that's something we could do, or something we could do something similar to that. So we'll look at, again, use a lot of the ideas that Gary was talking about and go through actually potential interface requirements, look at both inbound and outbound options, and go through some of the custom solutions myself and actually Gary and people have actually worked on over the years. So just maybe to give some ideas as what can be done, what people have done in the past, what other customers have done. When I started with Link 11, I started with, things were pretty simple. You tended to have a great big mainframe at the back. You had some kind of actually concentrator maybe, and a bunch of dumb screens. And the input to the system was an 80 by 24 screen, and you were pretty limited to what you could do. You could maybe get something to sort of flash some text on the screen or turn it to reverse video, and that was just about it. And the mainframe was the source of all information, and most users, if they were lucky, had a TD830 or an ET1100 they're sitting on their desk, which they used to access the then Link system. Things have moved on a bit. Nowadays, there are so many different sort of channels, it's difficult to keep track of it at times. You know, people now expect to be able to access their banking system at 3 o'clock in the morning on their iPhone. They expect to be able to go onto their iPad and look at some fancy screen and order their actual groceries at 11 o'clock at night. So we have to move with the times and provide different ways of accessing the systems. And many of the ideas that Gary was talking about are the ways we can do this, so we can start to interface with different sort of channels. So we now have a situation where AB Suite systems are not just the consumer of a request. They are the actual provider in some cases of requests coming into the system, and they're consuming other services, so other parts of the system, as that may be another application in your environment or an external web service. personally, I think it's kind of neat that probably some of the code that was running on the mainframe with a dumb screen is probably still in your AB Suite system, but we've now got so many different ways of accessing it compared to what we used to have. So let's have a look at a few of the examples of things we've done in the real world of actually using some of these ideas. This first one goes back a while, and what the customer wanted to do in those days was invoke something in the .NET framework from Azure Business Suite. In fact, they wanted to do it from EAE. They wanted to encrypt some data. So they had a piece of text, and it had to be encrypted using a industry standard 256-bit in Azure encryption mechanism. So the technique we used was to use Business Integrator and a hub, which Gary talked about. And that is, in very simplistic terms, what the hub is doing. There are two components. One is sitting on the MCP and one is sitting on Windows. But as far as the AB Suite system is concerned, it's basically talking to another AB Suite system. And then you tell it, I need to talk to a hub process which is running on this particular server at this particular port. And then what we get it to do is to talk to a .NET assembly somewhere. And of course, once you get into the .NET assembly world, you can do pretty much anything that .NET can do. The kind of neat thing with actually Business Integrator is it could almost be done the reverse. You didn't have to create an iSpec and then call it. You could go into Business Integrator and define the iSpec that you wanted to use. So in this case, what we've done is we haven't gone into AB Suite or EAE or done anything yet. We said, I want to have an iSpec that's got two fields on it. It's got some text, which is going to come from whichever text we want to encrypt, and we're going to pass back some secrets of value, which is the actually encrypted value. So I can do all of this without going anywhere near my EAE or AB Suite system. I can actually define, if you like, the iSpec at this point. And then when I'm happy, I can tell it to export this and re-import it into my AB Suite system. What I can then do is, within this same external components test environment, write a little bit of VB script to test what I want it to do. So, and what we can do here is basically call any COM component. So any COM component you've got installed on your server, we can invoke and call some method on it and get a response back. So in this case, what we did is we wrote some .NET code called external components, or the assembly was called external components, and it had a class on it called proxy, and it had a method on it called encrypt. So we could then use the standard features of .NET, and there are a huge number of encryption algorithms and processes available in the .NET world, to say, when you get one of these requests, create an instance of this object, create an instance of the class called proxy, and then invoke the encrypt method, pass in whatever you got on the text field, and pass it back in the secret value. And as Gary's mentioning, you get a lot of other information as part of the iSpec. So you know who called you, you know their language, you know their user code. So if you wanted to test, is this user even allowed here to do that, we could extend this VB script code here to do it. So that was a very simple way, and it was I found the neat bit was I could test all of this without going anywhere near the AB Suite system or the EA system. I could then hand over an iSpec to the actual developer and say, add that to your system, add a bit of code to invoke this process, and you'll get back an encrypted version of whatever you send in this text field. In the Windows world, if you have Agile Business Suite on Windows now, we could do that in a different way, actually. We could, in fact, as Gary was talking about, invoke an external actual method directly. Now, we did this for a client recently where they had a very large number of custom processes that they wanted to invoke from their AB Suite system. I mean, some of the examples here, one of the features they wanted was to take whatever came into the system in its raw format and write it to a table within the application database, because they wanted the users of the system to say, well, what exactly came into this system? Not what we think came into it, what was the actual buffer that came into this system and we actually processed. So we need to write that to a table within the database, and then we'll do the same with the response. We'll write the exact buffer that we sent out. So there's no question about what do we get and what do we send back. They also wanted to do things like get the report status. What are the current running actual reports within the system? They had the concept that not only was this system providing a number of functions to end users, but also to actually administrators of the system. And they didn't want to go to other places to get details about, well, what's happening with the system, what reports are running. Then there were numerous things like they used to get files in from some of the users which were variable widths, which made it hard for the reports to read. So we wrote a little routine to make them all fixed widths. We had some code to parse XML. Parsing XML is fairly easy to do in .NET. It's less easy to do in AB Suite. And there were many, many more that we were able to do. And we did this by writing an external library. The one we wrote for the customer was in C#. But if you're happier writing in VB.NET, there's no reason why you couldn't do that just as easily. And we can pass in all the parameters, as Andy was talking about yesterday, about different types. We can pass in Boolean, strings, and numbers, and then perform just about any function that we can do in .NET. And I would also actually reiterate Gary's point, make sure your function returns probably just a number to say, yes, it worked, no, it didn't. Or if you return a 0, or if you get 0 back in your AB Suite system, it means that function never even got called, and you've maybe not configured the system correctly. What if you want to invoke an external web service from your AB Suite system? Well, you could use a technique I've just actually described about on Windows. Just call an external library and get that to call the library for you. If you're on MCP, then use the AIS process that Gary talked about, and that will auto-generate the proxy code. You can also use ePortal to do much the same thing. ePortal, it's a little, it's not 100% straightforward at the moment, but they are working on it to make it very easy to make ePortal to invoke this external process. If we look at the way that AIS works, then it's basically we try to create as much of the code automatically for you as possible. So you start off by saying, I need to invoke this method in this class, in this assembly, from my AB Suite system. And you basically point AIS at your .NET process and say, build me the code so that my AB Suite system can call that. And all the bits in red you see on this slide, we generate for you automatically, in effect. So you still need to write a very small amount of code, a little bit in blue over here, so that your your AB Suite system can invoke the AIS, your proxy. But it's a very small amount of code. It's basically a stub around this bit of code. Then what happens is your AB Suite system makes a standard call to an external library. It invokes the AIS, your proxy. That's passed across the internal components of the ClearPath system to reach the corresponding .NET component running in the Windows part of the ClearPath, and invokes the .NET process that you pointed AIS at actually originally. Now, in this example, we're talking to some API gateway. and then it goes off into some third-party system. But again, pretty much when you get to .NET, you're free to do anything that the .NET world it can do. So it could be calling an external library, it could be encrypting data, it could be calling any of the thousands of classes you have available in the .NET world. So all the functionality of the .NET framework world is effectively available to your AB Suite system. And again, we create most of the code for you. Okay, this is a customer we're working with at the moment to create microservices around elements of their AB Suite system. They have an ongoing program to expose as much as possible of their online banking system as a series of services which can be accessed by users using either iPads, mobile phones, or their laptop. And they want to do it basically as quickly and easily as possible. They don't want to have to rewrite great chunks of the system. And ideally, they want as much as possible to be automated. And as Gary was showing in his demo, ePortal does a lot of this work for you totally automatically. In effect, you run the ePortal actual generator process, and using that, you can automatically create RESTful services from your iSpecs. This will work pretty much totally automatically. You don't have to write any code at all to do this. And you will expose iSpecs as a RESTful service. You then get all the automatic scaling and management that ePortal does. And we're using industry standard tools. So the code we create is using the standard Microsoft Web API actual project type. So anything you can get, or any of the free bits you get with the Microsoft Web API, you automatically get by using the ePortal, your solution. It also means you can use pretty much any of the standard API testing tools which are available on the market. So things like the Postman. Your testing team can point their Postman environment at a ClearPath ePortal system and test it in the same way as they test everything else. So the way this works in this customer environment is they have their client applications, some of which are part of their online actual banking environment, some of which are calls coming in from an external actual business. So there's no, if you like, there's no user there. It's some other business process making requests into their system. It's a business-to-business request. All that's been agreed is the format of the API or the schema that they have to agree to. So the calls come into this area here, the enterprise service bus. This is a component that the customer has which looks at the incoming request and says, okay, this is a request I need to route to the ClearPath system. It's something to do with the online actual banking system. And it will call a RESTful API. The RESTful API is effectively converted, if you like, into an iSpec call. So ePortal will generate all the code to take the incoming actual JSON message, which has come in via the actual RESTful API, actually populate the appropriate fields on the iSpec, make a call to the Agile, your business suite system. When it gets a response back, it will create a corresponding actual JSON actual message to send back. So the bits in yellow really don't know they're talking to an AB Suite system. It's just a standard RESTful API that they're talking to. They're doing the gets and the puts and whatever they need here to do to invoke whatever they need to do within that system. Now, you could take your existing iSpecs and simply expose them as RESTful APIs or web services. However, chances are they were probably not originally designed to be exposed as a RESTful service or web API, and they've got a lot of stuff on the screen, which is, if you like, AB Suite year specific. So they'll have something like an act months field on there, and maybe some of the field names may be less obvious as to what they really are. But it will work. You could take this and expose it as a RESTful service, and a consumer of this service could fill in the appropriate values, and they will get back this. This actually particular example is showing a actually WCF test environment. But exactly the same concept works if you're working with actually JSON and actually RESTful services. But using ePortal, what you can do is say, well, actually, we don't want to send all this lot out. We don't want one service which does multiple functions, add, change, update, actually delete. We want one function which does go away and get me the customer details for customer XYZ. And that's all the consumer of this service needs to know. There is a service available against the AB Suite system, which if you give it the name of the customer you want, it will give you back everything you want. So what we can do is say, okay, well, let's go into ePortal, and in addition to the actual message types created from the iSpec, we'll create a new one, which has just got the data we want the consumer to send us, just the customer ID. Then what we can do is to, using ePortal and this little dialog which pops up, is say when you get a request for just get me the customer details, take whatever the customer has sent in, or whatever the web service has sent in, and set that to the customer number field. And then hard code what we sent to maint to INQ. So now we have a service that when we invoke it and it calls, in this case, the other customer iSpec, it's actually populated the maint field with INQ, and it's taken whatever we've come in from the service with the customer name. Then we get a response back. So it's a very quick and simple way of building microservices around existing components. You could take any standard component in your EAE or AB Suite system and pretty much without writing any code, create 4 microservices around it to add, remove, change, and update the data. And of course, if you didn't want the ability to be able to actually remove the record, you don't create a microservice that will do it. And then there's no way that the consumer of that service can inadvertently actually remove a record. That's just a simple example of calling an iSpec to pull back data from a standard component. What we could also do is create some kind of workflow. So we can say lots of AB Suite systems have this concept of actually a copy from screen, where you want to return a list of maybe customer names. And the common way of doing it is you go to a copy from screen, you call up the first list, you press OK, there's some more, and you keep actually pressing OK until you've got the full list coming back. And what this screen is, and what this workflow is doing, is to orchestrate that process, saying, OK, take the incoming actual request, navigate to this SERCH iSpec, now keep looping around until you get the start name is not equal to, while it's not equal to spaces, keep looping around and build up a response. So we can pull back maybe all the values from a copy from screen or a whole sequence of copy from screens into a single response. You could also do this through a list of values. ePortal supports the concepts of list of values coming back from your host. So rather than maybe looping around a copy from screen, you could have a single screen which has a list of values on and return that. And ePortal will understand your list of values and send it back on the client. But again, there is virtually no coding to write. It's nearly all point and the click. if you do decide to write your own custom code, the way the ePortal solution is structured is, if you like, all the Unisys code gets put into one area and all your custom code gets put into another. So if you decide, okay, we want to add a new iSpec, or Unisys comes out with a later level of ePortal and you need to rebuild it, it's only the Unisys code that gets overwritten, not your custom code. So it's ePortal is very easy to use, effectively straight out of the box. B, if you want to customize it and extend whatever we do, we're very careful not to override what you've done when we make a change to ePortal. So and you rebuild stuff. So what ePortal will do basically is, you've got your AB Suite system at the top, and it will create something called actually as a data source. You basically give it the list of iSpecs you want to expose as your services, and it will create a data source around it. You then create a number of clients which are consumers of this data source. So this is your iSpec list in effect. And from that, we can create a number of different style of client applications. We can create smart clients, something that will run on an iPad. You can take your screen that you've painted in AB Suite and convert it to a pretty good looking screen on an iPad. You can create model view, your controller, actually graphical screens. Again, it will take whatever you've painted in the AB Suite system and create a standard Microsoft style model view controller. So the V in this is the view, and that's your iSpecs. So when you run this, whatever you've painted in your AB Suite system will appear as an active view. You can create actually WCF services, as I've shown. So this is Windows Foundation from Microsoft. You can create a service for that. Or what's happening more and more these days is people are creating web API services. So they're exposing either existing iSpecs or they're writing new iSpecs as some form of microservice that they want able to actually invoke from their system. So what this customer did was they wrote some new iSpecs, and only about half a dozen or so. And then we built an ePortal data source for those half dozen iSpecs and exposed them as a web API service. You then get automatically Swagger documentation. Again, Swagger is not a Unisys standard. It's becoming almost the industry standard for how microservices and especially RESTful services are actually defined. This is not the customer system. This is something else. But if you run ePortal against your AB Suite system and create microservices using ePortal, you will get something looking very similar to this with post and get options to access your system. And then you can test it. Swagger, you can run Swagger through your web browser. If you actually click on one of these post or get buttons, it will open up and you can key in the values that you want to test it. So it's a very quick and easy way of testing that the ePortal solution is basically doing what you expect. And then you give this documentation to the people who are writing the code for the service, for the processes which are actually consuming your services. So again, and that is what they are probably used to. They will expect to get something like this from the AB Suite team to say, these are the services we're exposing. You don't need to know how they work or what they do. You just need to invoke the appropriate put or actually get method. Something else you could do with ePortal is create an MVC style application, so a model view controller, but with a actual graphical front end. And again, because we're using the standard Microsoft Web API actual project type, you get all the extra goodies, if you like, which come with that. We simply create the M bit, the model bit, which is the iSpecs, And the view bit, which is the iSpec, which is this, if you like, this orangey coloured area on the screen, this is what I painted in an AB Suite system. So what we've got here is an application, a standard MVC style application, and we can add in or use all the different sort of bootstrap options for your formatting, creating fancy effects on the screen if you want, or in this case, just creating some tabs actually across the top of the screen. So this area is the screen as painted in AB Suite. If the user clicks on one of the other tabs, it calls up some information actually associated with the student. So what this code has done is say, okay, I've had student number 1 come down from the host. I'll go and make a call to some document storage system and pull out some other documentation, maybe what this student's actually is studying. And if it pulls up the next customer or the next student, it will automatically change what's displayed to show the right data. So this is a case of you have a screen, but it's not purely AB Suite data that's being actually rendered within the browser. You're rendering some of the data's coming from an AB Suite, some of the data's maybe coming from a web storage. And I went on, and this actual customer needed to go to an external web service. So we were able to call the external web service to get some information about the actual company that the student was working for, pull back some extra data, and then pull up a Google map to say this is where it is. So again, it's a case of you're not just restricted to displaying whatever's come back from your AB Suite system. You could have a fairly complex composite application which is pulling back data from a multiple of sources, one of which happens to be your AB Suite system. And 90% of this code was built for me automatically by using ePortal. If you don't want to do it through a web browser, you could do it through actually WinForms. Again, this is the, actually Gary mentioned the VB Forms builder. So this is effectively, behind this area here, is what has been created by the VB Forms builder. So, and it's basically rendering again whatever I painted in AB Suite. But in this case, we've rendered it in a C# WinForms application. And again, I've got multiple panels on the screen, one of which is showing the actual document storage information. So I pull back the data for this student, pull back something from the actual document storage system. And in this case, I've also shown the raw data going up and down from the host. So again, it's a case of you don't have to have an application which only shows data from your AB Suite system. You can pull data from almost anywhere else that you want to do. Okay. This was a customer I worked with a few years back, and it was when the ability to use public segment methods was just coming out. And we had a need to simply actually validate an account number. So as part of the process that we were going through, the first step that if you like, the web environment did was say, have I got a valid account number? Is it worth carrying on doing anything else? Now, we could have written an iSpec to do that, but it's probably a little bit overkill just to validate one field. So because we were able to write a public segment method and invoke it via client tools, that was much simpler. There's far less code in the method to validate an account number. It's probably only 1 or 2 lines of code within the actual method. So it's less overhead, it's less costly, it's almost certainly faster. And in ePortal 11 and above, the ability to do this is incorporated into ePortal. So in addition to be able to invoke iSpecs as part of your workflow, or as the process which it provides the data for a web service request, you can do it within the ePortal. And again, ePortal will do 99% of the hard work for you in building all the interface code that you need to invoke your web service. Sorry, your iSpec. So this is a way of taking some of the methods within your AB Suite system and making them actually publicly available to other parts of the system. This again was an internal one. This was the end user didn't want users to sign on twice. They wanted to take whatever the user code and password that the user had used to log on to their actual laptop or whatever, and log on to the AB Suite system. The problem was complicated by the fact that this particular system runs on both MCP and Windows. So we needed to come up with a way of being able to actually check the user was correct, authenticate them, without and have that run on both MCP and on actually Windows. So the way we do that is we basically put an extra hidden iSpec in at the start of the process. And that iSpec basically calls the server and says, are you really the server I think I'm talking to, in effect? And at that point, the server will create a key to say, yes, this is really me, pass it back via this hidden iSpec. The client then responds and says, this is me, and passes it back. So by the time we get to this stage here, both parties know that they are valid and they are actually correct in terms of we have a correct client because we know we've picked up their user code from their Ash credentials when they signed on. And we can validate that user is allowed to use that system. So once we've got through that process, we know it's all out. And this was all done using standard library calls out, as actually Gary was explaining, either using calls to the Windows API or making calls via MCP to its own batch encryption libraries. Okay, another example we had was a customer needed to create some better looking screens, if you like. They had some screens in their system. Using something like the MVC actually environment meant they could create things which looked a lot better. They had a lot more scope. Once you exported your screens into the Microsoft MVC environment and you've got the web API, you've got all the tools that you have available within Visual Studio to create nice looking screens. So they use ePortal to basically generate the data source and the initial go, if you like, at creating a screen. They then had some very clever web actually developers take that and make it look nice and make it interface with other systems. They use the orchestration features to create actually the composite screens, either one to many, one screen got data from actually many iSpecs, or actually many screens talk to the same iSpec. And they ended up with some pretty good looking screens. So these are ePortal screens running in an MVC environment with all the benefits you get from the ePortal actual management environment, talking to an AB Suite system. So you can make your AB Suite system look pretty good with minimal effort almost, or just some people who know really how to design actually web pages. This is also a system I worked on where they had a huge number of online services. This is this is actually the Isle of Man actually government, where they had a very large number of services that the residents of the island can access. You can get actually travel service, or I mean, for example, now if you want to go to the Isle of Man, you have to fill in a form to say you haven't got actually COVID, or COVID, and this is where I'm going to be staying for the 2 weeks on the Isle of Man. The idea behind all this is they didn't want users of this system to know anything about the back-end system. In the case of the Isle of Man, the income tax system is an AB Suite system. But there are numerous other systems in there. There are Oracle applications, there are pure SharePoint applications, there are third-party applications. And what we wanted to do was make the infrastructure of the environment as common as possible. So it's almost at the last possible moment that it says, okay, I need to talk to an AB Suite system, or I need to talk to an Oracle system. And the way we did this was come up with our own, what we termed iSpec parser, which was to take a .NET class, so we had effectively a data contract, which was data customer. And within that, we had a number of data members, in this case, name. So we added these custom options to say this data contract is handled by the iSpec cust. And within this data contract, this field, name, corresponds to the cust name field. We then had code to basically analyze and parse this code at runtime and convert it to the appropriate iSpec. And then when the response came back from the AB Suite system, we took the iSpec, and there was basically the reverse process, which went through and said, okay, I've got a field called custnam from the host system. We'll use it to actually populate this field within the actual data contract. So 90% of the system doesn't know what the backend system's doing. All the systems follow this same basic rule of having data contracts which are passed to some process which only at the last moment almost decided, okay, I need to convert this data contract to the appropriate way of doing it. And this used the component enabler that Gary was talking about. It basically used component enabler and actually Rattle to talk to the AB Suite system. And it was pretty successful. Something else we did for the same customer was create an interface to Word and Microsoft Office. What we needed to do here was there was a list of pro forma letters that they wanted to send to end users. So this is not a bulk email, if you like. This is just, we need to send this one particular letter to this one customer at this time. So the end users could log on to the backend AB Suite system, choose the account they wanted, which is appropriate to send out a letter, choose what kind of actually letter they wanted to send, and then basically hit to go. And we made it such that the AB Suite system, or the front end of the AB Suite system, fired off a request to load Word with the appropriate Word template, passing in the account number that they wanted to use. The Word document had a macro in it, which would then connect back to the AB Suite system and pull out the name and address and a few other pieces of information and put them into the appropriate place actually on the letter. The actual letter was then saved to a document management system, and we sent an email to the user. We didn't send them the actual letter. We just said, you need to log on to your online system and look at this new actual letter that we've sent you. And obviously update the Agile Business System to where we'd actually put it. The actual benefits to them was they didn't have to post anything. I think when I was working on the system, they were posting something like 300,000 documents every year. After this, they didn't post. They stopped sending those 300,000 actual letters. There's a huge sort of benefit in printing and postage. It also meant that if the user or the end user or the recipient of the letter phoned up and said, "What does all this mean?" the end user of the AB Suite system could call up exactly the same letter that the actual recipient was looking at and explain what was going on. This is a similar actual letter system, but for bulk letters, if you like, or actually potential bulk letters. This was an application where we had a report running which used the standard MCP interface to talk to actually WebSphere from IBM and make a request to generate a letter. So the report would run, and it would say, we need to send this letter or these letters to these recipients, and put a bunch of requests basically onto a queue. That MQ request was then picked up, passed to a document creation system, which did whatever it needed to do, and passed a response back. And then we use client tools to populate the AB Suite system again. So, yep, that's all been processed, and we've got the letter back, and it's all been handled, and it's now stored in this location. And we can do the reverse. We can get systems to call in via MQ series. So this was a client we worked with a while back who had a huge number of XML actual messages coming in via MQ series from a large number of actual channels. Some of it was users internal users on the system making inquiries. Some were external users of the system, so people who'd been authorized to log on to this company's website and make inquiries. They even had a sort of batch style interface where they could submit several hundred requests at once. Now this uses something that Gary mentioned, which is the direct, if you like, .NET interface into an AB Suite system. It's called the COM Manager interface, and it's effectively an interface directly to the .NET DLL that AB Suite creates for a Windows environment. So all the iSpecs which have a user interface, and you can then call through this COM Manager interface. You can also handle lists of values, and as I said, it removes one of the restrictions of Component Enabler in that we can pass very big messages in and get very big messages back. And we have full access to all the iSpecs. We can access it in a normal way via field name. If you really want to, you can access it via NOF and also via an XML style interface. You can ask it to give you an XML representation of the iSpec. If you're heavily into the XML route and you're on AB Suite on Windows, that now supports a native XML interface. So this is not, if you like, coming in through a standard iSpec style buffer. This is the ability to pass your AB Suite system an XML message. The first step is to tell AB Suite, your AB Suite application, what the XML message looks like by telling it the schema. You can either go into AB Suite itself or the AB Suite development environment, and there's a way of defining the schema within that. Or you can take an industry standard XSD file and import that and say, this is the schema of what I'm going to send you. You can then invoke a new method in AB Suite. So this is not, if you like, the standard iSpec cycle. This is a new interface into your AB Suite system, and pass an XML message in. AB Suite will automatically create the code into Blue here. So it will parse the message for you, make sure that what you've passed in conforms to the schema, validate that your message conforms to the schema, and then basically deserialize that message and pass it to your iSpec logic. At this point, you can use whatever LDL plus logic that you want to process what came in your XML message and build a corresponding XML response and then send that back. So this is excuse me. This is an alternative, if you like, to the iSpec cycle, in that you can pass in an XML message. Suppose that none of what I've said fits what you want. You can do your own. You can build a custom generator. There is documentation on how to do this in the manuals, and there's some samples around of what's the sort of thing that you can do. And effectively, as part of the build process, AB Suite will invoke your code saying, I've got an iSpec called cust. Then it will say, on this iSpec, there's a field called maint or something. And it will tell you all about that field. It's been defined as a button on the screen. It's in this location and whatever. You can then take that information and do whatever you want with it. So what I did as a simple test case was say, well, let's build an XSD from the information we know about the screen defined actually on the actual graphical representation of that screen. Well, let's take all the data we know and build it. So we know, for example, that there should be a field called user maint coming in, and it has to be of length 3. And it has to be one of these values. It cannot be anything else. So we can give this XSD, or even as a JSON schema version of it, to the actual developers who are calling my system and say, here's an XSD of what the iSpec looks like. If you don't pass me a message, if you pass me a message which fails this schema validation, it will be instantly actually rejected. So this is a way of making sure that whatever you pass to your AB Suite system at least matches the schema of the iSpec that you're trying to get a call. So, in conclusion, pretty much as actually Gary said, yes, in the case of yes, we can is almost the simplest way of saying it. We can make AB Suite interoperate with just about anything else that's out there going. Whether it's a simple call to a .NET service, whether it's calling an AB Suite system, whether it's Microsoft Word invoking your system or Microsoft Excel invoking your system, we can make it do pretty much anything. But come and talk to us about what you want to do. We've been there quite often. We've had ideas, or we've talked to other customers about things. So quite often we've got maybe some ideas that perhaps you hadn't thought of, or different ways of actually approaching the problem you're trying to fix. So, thank you very much.
Jill, I think there are some questions in the chat window and in the Q&A window.
Okay, in the chat window, the only things that have come in about white papers, so I've just posted locations for the various white papers that we've talked about, or the subjects we've talked about. So I hadn't actually looked in the Q&A windows or anything.
But there's something more in the chat window, Andy, I think.
Oh, is there? Did I miss something? Okay, chat window. Let me resize it. Oh, come on. Sorry, having trouble with the UI now.
All right.
I can see them, then carry on. I mean, you don't need to rely.
I can see a question from Kurt Thompson. Question is, if you want to access a database on Windows from your ABS application, which technique would you recommend?
Yeah, we covered that at the end of the last session.
Right. Then the next one is ABS and JSON messaging supporting. What did you SOAP?
Replied to that one. That's
all right.
ePortal is the answer for that. Okay.
Then web support through a library from Rodrigo Sobiak.
Okay, that must be in the Q&A then.
It's in the chat window.
Yeah, I have a question. If I'm calling web app support through a library, how can I handle errors? If my API does not respond, my comms call still waiting, and my system entering deadlock. And there was a supplementary question about JSON as well from the web API.
If I'm calling web app support, how can I handle it? Well, the web app support is a series of APIs, a series of method calls. So each of the calls should return a result value that you can interrogate If you're calling it through a library, then your library would need to inspect those result values and return a response to you. I'm guessing the reference to deadlock is obviously you're doing these calls, you may be in database transaction state. So you want to keep the time frames for these calls to a minimum. I don't think there's a simple answer, but fundamentally web app support will return a result on every call that you invoke, even if that's a timeout type result. And the library that you use to interface would need to handle that. I mean, I would say that with web app support, you can call it directly from AB Suite code. I mean, Gary mentioned earlier the web service wizard. That's an example of it's generating code within AB Suite to talk directly to web app support. You don't need a sort of middle tier library. Not sure there's much else I can add to that for now. How can I parse JSON result from a web API? Well, I guess Nigel's probably better placed to answer that because that's going to be an ePortal type scenario. By the time it reaches AB Suite, it won't be a JSON format message.
No, that's correct. ePortal will effectively take whatever you define as a JSON API, as a JSON message, and actually populate the appropriate fields. So your AB Suite application never sees actually JSON; it sees iSpecs.
Yeah.
And so same going back out. You don't have to build a sort of JSON message within your AB Suite application. It's built within ePortal for you.
Yeah, maybe that's the problem. Is it's people understanding that the JSON message itself still has to go to something, and that's what ePortal is providing. That thing that the JSON message goes to is.
The thing that it goes to is a standard Microsoft Web API solution, if you like. Microsoft have this standard for creating JSON style actually messages, and that's what ePortal, if you like, or what ePortal will build for you, and you then expose as the services you want your consumers to actually invoke. ePortal will then, behind the scenes, take that JSON request coming in, convert it to the appropriate iSpec request, populate the appropriate fields, send it to the host system, and when it gets a response back, build us a JSON version of whatever's come back from the host.
And you don't need to use. You talked there about using ePortal, and that's going to take some of the hard work out of doing it. But if you wanted to, there's no reason why you couldn't just use Web API and Component Enabler APIs to achieve exactly the same thing.
You could do exactly the same thing. If you want to write your own from the ground up, then fine. You could use the same thing. If you've got some,
it's going to take you longer, and you're going to have to put more effort into doing it. But it's possible.
The ePortal process at that point is sort of customizable. The way we, if you like, convert iSpecs into JSON is using the scaffolding process, which again is a standard process using T4 the templates to create the code you need. And what you can do is customize either the Unisys scaffolding process to convert iSpecs into JSON, or write your own. So you could still take advantage of the ePortal scalability and all the other bits and pieces it gives you. But if you want to, or you don't like the way we do it, or you want to extend the way we do it, then it's perfectly that's actually perfectly straightforward to do. And in fact, we've done it on actually several sites.
Thanks. There's another question, which is, what did you mean by Unisys is still making ePortal more usable?
I think that's, well, I mean, part of the thing that they've added recently is actually better support for lists of values. List of values is a very powerful feature in AB Suite to be able to send as it said, maybe a list of customers, their name, the first line of the address, and there's a balance. Yeah, perhaps it used to be with ePortal, it was a bit, you had to do a bit of work to understand it. ePortal 11, they've now introduced some new options to make it much easier for the client to understand what's coming back from the system. And also they've added this option to the ability to invoke public segment methods. So it's constantly evolving. They're constantly adding new features and making it easier to take advantage of what's coming out of AB Suite.
Good. I don't see anything else. We'll give it a couple of minutes in case anybody wants to respond to what we've been saying, but I don't see any new questions arriving. I'm guessing, Carol, we're probably just about done then.
All right. So thank you for presenting. Thanks everyone for joining. Tomorrow we'll meet the same time as we did today. The subject will be application lifecycle management.
There is actually another question just came in, Andy.
Yes. All right.
Yeah, I missed that one. Oh, so you're right. It's just arrived. Will UX mode be made available to MCP? I think currently there are no plans to do that. I don't know if Howard is still on the call. Vanga's on the call. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I would say about those sort of things is raise it as an NFS.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you believe that you have a potential use for it, raise it as an NFS, and that may be something that could be added to the product, or maybe there's some alternatives to achieve the same sort of thing in the future.
Yeah, good point, Gary. Yeah. Raising an NFS will help us to see how important it is and evaluate it. Yeah.
I think also if there are particular aspects of UX that you're interested in, include that as well. Just so we understand what your requirement is. Okay.
All right. So I see no more questions. So then we are done for today, and see you tomorrow.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Goodbye.